I'm a pretty big fan of emulation because personally, I think it's one of the best ways to preserve video games from the past. But every so often, we get asked by a lot of companies to take a look at certain video game systems that they've produced that emulate older video games. And when the folks at funnyplaying.com asked us to take a look at this system here, and even this system here, well, I was pretty excited. But then when I started to play them, things got a little bit weird. Let's take a closer look.
When anyone reaches out to us to send in a product, I typically look at the product and do a little research online. And when I saw this first product here, I thought it was the Revo K101. I mean, of course I did. Look at the thing. It looks exactly like this system. But as soon as the console arrived in the mail, upon closer inspection, I realized that it actually wasn't that. The system is called the Retrogame, which, let me tell you, is a heck of a thing to search online because, yeah, it plays retro games, but there's a lot of retro game devices out there, so calling this the Retrogame makes it almost impossible to find online. So of course I had to dig a little bit deeper. This is called the Retrogame RS-97, or otherwise known as the K101 Pro. But you see, that's where they're trying to get you. Now when you hear the name K101 Pro, you probably assume it's a sequel to another system called the Revo K101. For those of you out there that don't know what that system is, initially the Revo K101 is a GBA clone. It basically plays Game Boy Advance games through a cartridge slot on the bottom, and also has the ability to play ROMs. From the reviews and the research that I've looked at, it's a very cool portable system. But what you got right here, this K101 Pro, isn't. I don't even know how this happened, but someone out there was making Revo K101 units, and apparently, as far as I can tell, they stopped making them. So one company, that I believe is funnyplaying.com, decided to rip it off. That's right, kids, we're taking a look at a ripoff of a clone system. Because the original system is a clone console, you might just assume that they would be using the exact same hardware and software, but as far as I can tell, they're not doing that. The box on the side says it supports a whole bunch of different games and systems, but because I know for a fact that this is a clone system of a clone system, well, the chances of that running well are as close to zero as you can get. But of course, you gotta give it a chance, and when I did, it locked up and crashed. Not once, not twice, 5 times. 5 times during this review, this system would lock up and crash. And when it locks up, it prevents the power button from turning the system on and off. Now, you probably assume that that would be a very big deal, and you'd be right, because the only way to reset the system is to unscrew the battery pack plate at the back and take out the battery, and then put the battery back in and start the system. It's so annoying, and after a little while, I just assumed that the system would crash and lock up at some point, that I would just have to keep my screwdriver handy close to me while playing this console. The system has some extended media functionality in it, like having the ability to listen to music or watching videos or reading PDF documents or even looking at pictures, but half the time I tried these things, it locked up the system. And likely you wouldn't be getting this for those things anyway, you'd be getting this to play games. But even on playing games, it fails hard. Very much like the Revo K101, there's a GBA cartridge slot on the bottom so that you can play Game Boy Advance games. At least that's what I assume. Every time I tried to put in a Game Boy Advance cartridge on the bottom of the system, it would lock up and crash. And after so many attempts, I just couldn't get it to work. So just consider that a non-functioning item. But to be completely fair, they never actually said it could play GBA games. It's just when you see a Game Boy Advance cartridge slot on the bottom of a system, you would expect it to do it. But it didn't work. What it did come with, though, was a TF card reader that goes into that slot. Now, the TF card reader didn't seem to work on any other system I had, and I think it was specifically designed for this console. But even then, that thing crashed on me a lot, and I couldn't even get that to work. So here, a lot of problems already, things aren't looking great, but guess what, folks? It has games built into the system, and these are the things we're going to use to test its ability to play video games, something that I'm really starting to think it's not going to be able to do. The first collection of games goes underneath the name CPS, which I believe means the Capcom Play System, which was an arcade board that was used for a whole bunch of classic arcade games. It didn't matter what game I tried out, there was always some kind of issue, whether it be major or minor. Every game on this list doesn't play right, whether it be the music being wrong, the sound effects being wrong, the way it controls being sloppy and unresponsive, or in many cases, just the graphics were inaccurate with screen tearing and just slow speeds in general. But you know what? What you're seeing here is the best example you're gonna get of games running on here. These games are pretty old and they don't require a lot of power to be emulated properly. It's not like it's running 3D graphics or anything like that. These are old 2D games that should just run better, and they don't. But even at the worst points, maybe these games are passable to play, maybe, but I still wouldn't give it that credit anyway. Because for many gamers out there that have never played an original arcade machine, they may think this is the way these games are supposed to perform, which I personally believe is a great disservice to the original developers of these games. And that's without getting into the fact that these games were definitely not legally licensed. But folks, what if I told you what you're seeing here is the best example of games running on the platform? Because everything else is way downhill. Next up on the list is Neo Geo games. Now, if you're a big fan of Neo Geo, chances are you probably love that intro sound that's just so iconic. You know, this intro music. Ah, memories. Such a wonderful intro sound. Now let's listen to it on this system. Oh cool, it sounds like you took your Neo Geo and threw it in a bathtub filled with Jello.
Excuse me?
Maybe I'm expecting perfection from a Neo Geo emulator, but generally at the very top end, if you hear the theme song playing like that, you know something's wrong. And every ROM that's available on the system has bad audio, every single game. And some of the games run a little bit better than others, but generally they all just perform incredibly lackluster. It's almost like the arcade games we played earlier, but now they just seem to run a lot slower, and sometimes the input just doesn't work 100% all the time. And to add further frustration, you'll find that many of the games are mislabeled, which just makes it so much harder when you're trying to find a specific game. Next up is Game Boy Advance. Now you would assume that this would be able to run on this console because hey, it's a clone of a system that could run Game Boy Advance games. Well, you would be wrong, wouldn't you? Because no, it doesn't work. None of the games work properly. Whether it's poor frame rate, bad sound effects, screen tearing, or a billion other problems, no Game Boy Advance game I played on this system ran anywhere near close to being okay. It's shocking, especially considering that I'm quite certain the original system that this console's based off of could run those games effortlessly. It's a clone system of the GBA. How did you mess this up? And even if you could look past all of that stuff, sometimes you'll be playing a game that will just magically turn off, like Grand Theft Auto Advance. When you go to start up the game, it just stops. And it doesn't like freeze or anything like that, it just goes back to the game selection screen. The emulator is so unstable that you can't use it to play any games, because you don't know at what point the game is just gonna crash for no reason at all. Next up is the Super Nintendo, and let's just cut straight to the chase. Every single game on this emulator has screen tearing, and it runs at 5 or 10 frames less than where it should be at. That means that every game you play is going to be impossible to play as long as it has some kind of mechanic where you have to push a button at a certain point. Which, guess what? That's most of the games ever made. Donkey Kong Country runs like a nightmare, and Super Mario Kart is impossible because you just don't have proper control of your character. And this issue also extends to other games like The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, because even a game like that requires precise button movements at certain points. But past the Super Nintendo, there's no way that they could be having emulation issues with much less superior systems. Now, I'm not saying the Sega Genesis is a slouch or anything, but it should run a little bit better, right? Wrong. It runs just as bad as the Super Nintendo, and in some cases, worse, somehow. It just is an amazing thing to see an emulator fail so consistently at running any kind of game you throw at it. Sonic the Hedgehog 3 has a bonus stage right at the very beginning of the first stage, and it's so easy to complete, for me at least, and I've been playing it ever since I was a kid. And on this emulated version, it was the very first time that I failed because the input lag was just so dramatic. So let's take it back even further to the days of the NES. And of course, as you might imagine, none of the NES games run well. Everything's really slow and there's a very large noticeable input lag, which is shocking considering this is the NES. If it can't run NES games, I mean, how much of a chance is it gonna have against Game Boy? Well, we tried it, and every single Game Boy Color and Game Boy game had incredibly bad performance. In fact, I would say these were the worst running games on the entire platform, which is hilarious because Nintendo managed managed to get Game Boy games to run like decades ago, but these guys are having a serious problem with it. Every game is improperly scaled, has serious visual glitches, and in some cases, it just runs really slow or too fast in some cases. You just can't get a solid experience, and you're really unable to play anything properly. And it was around this time that the system crashed and locked up again. But this point, I didn't want to unscrew and take out the battery. I just left it there. I didn't turn the system on ever again. But this wasn't the only console they sent me. They sent me something else called the Retromini. The system is almost identical to the other system they sent me, only it just has 36 Game Boy Advance games built into it. And guess what? None of them work. I mean, sure, they turn on and everything, but the frame rates are inconsistent and the gameplay is sloppy because of it. It's just not worth picking up. Don't even look at it thinking it looks cool, because sure, it looks a little interesting, but if it doesn't play video games, what's the point of it existing? And for one final added kick to the teeth, underneath the Retrogame, the very first system we looked at, there was a hidden video game system called the Game Poke just underneath it. I didn't even know what this was because I wasn't expecting to get it in, but it's apparently some kind of mini Tetris-like clone system, but it's got an awful D-pad, terrible controls, and it's almost impossible to look at unless you're holding it in the sun in the right way. I don't even know why it's here. Why was this even bundled with everything? What was the purpose of this? But okay, look, let's just forget about the Game Poke for a second and go back to the Retrogame and the Retromini. Those two systems, I believe, may have the ability to upgrade their firmware or at least update their software somehow. And if there's an ability to do that, there's a chance that these systems may be actually able to run games better in the future. Now that won't save their bad controls or the fact that everything about them seems to suck, but if the software was at least halfway decent, maybe they would be okay to be used as portable game systems. But even then, I wouldn't hold my breath.
So, that was technically 3 console reviews in one, and I didn't even expect that, so whatever. Look, folks, if you ever see one of these in the wild and you think it's the Revo K101, make sure that it actually has the logo right beneath the screen. Otherwise, it's a knockoff. This right here is the funnyplaying.com K101 Pro knockoff thing. Look, you saw how bad it ran games. And if they ever do a firmware update, I honestly think there might be a chance for this thing to be good. And this one too, the Retromini, has a really nice feel and design, but the games don't run well on it. And both of these systems kind of have the same problems. If the consoles can't run older video games, then there's no reason to own them, no matter how good the shells are. And even though they are pretty decent shells, I don't even think they originally designed them. So, those are the systems from funnyplaying.com. If you ever see them in the wild, be careful.